When Game Theory released Part 4 of their Ultimate FNAF Timeline a couple years ago, a lot of people were caught off guard when MatPat suggested the idea that William Afton's wife was not only relevant to the story, but also the one behind everything in Security Breach. A lot of people were quick to write it off as MatPat just making things up in order to create a narrative, but I don't think it's actually as crazy as people think. In fact, I think there's actually evidence for her involvement outside of what was mentioned in Game Theory's timeline video that, from what I've seen, has gone almost entirely under the radar. So stay tuned and consider subscribing, because I plan to explain just how much evidence points to Mrs. Afton potentially being involved, and how it would actually make sense even with the Mimic being the current major villain of the story. For starters, since it has been about 2 years since Part 4 of Game Theory's timeline was released, I feel like I should first go over what was proposed in that video, and then what I think does and doesn't hold up. The main focus of the video was the idea that Mrs. Afton inherited the position of Fazbear Entertainment CEO since both of the original founders, as well as all of their relatives, ended up dead except for her. MatPat claimed that Mrs. Afton spent the time between Henry setting William and the other animatronics on fire in Pizzeria Simulator and the events of Security Breach attempting to put her dead family back together after discovering William's remnant experiments. In that video, it was proposed that FNAF AR having animatronics sent out to be infused with collected remnant was how she got the remnant energy to do what she wanted to do. Help Wanted gave her an environment to rebuild William's mind through Glitchtrap, as well as obtain a replacement for her daughter Elizabeth through a brainwashed beta tester named Vanessa. She built a robot replacement of the crying child and taught him who he was supposed to be in the post-it note room, where there was a table set up with robots representing each of the Aftons. The Pizzaplex was built on top of the Pizzeria Simulator location to give her access to her husband's body, and using Glamrock Freddy for the excavation of the rubble led to the spirit of her oldest son Michael possessing the animatronic. Then Gregory went rogue during Security Breach and her little family fantasy fell apart at the seams. As much as there are issues with the theory, especially since it was made before the release of Security Breach's Ruin DLC and the Help Wanted 2 game, MatPat did have decent evidence for the idea of Mrs. Afton being important to the story that technically is still valid, even in light of the Mimic being revealed at the end of Ruin. After all, while people are quick to write off evidence in main game Security Breach after the creator of the franchise, Scott Cawthon, mentioned that there were miscommunications about what the purpose of certain clues he told the company that made the games, Steelwool Studios, to include were supposed to be, that doesn't change that Scott did tell them to include certain things in the game, or the fact that we ended up with the game that we did. Just because Scott said he used Ruin to get the story back on track doesn't negate that Security Breach is the game that we got instead of whatever he may have originally planned. And getting things back on track doesn't mean that what we got was retconned out of existence. Plus, just because there is a main villain of the arc in the Mimic, that doesn't mean there can't be any others. William Afton was the primary antagonist of the arc up through Pizzeria Simulator, but that didn't stop Circus Baby from also being an important one during Sister Location. Even if the Mimic is the current focus, that doesn't mean there can't be other characters that will show up later or are operating behind the scenes. After all, like MatPat mentioned in his timeline, Vanessa got the position of Pizzaplex security guard from someone at the top of the company, and it wouldn't be too outrageous for the last surviving relative of the company's founders to be the one to inherit the position and then give her that role as part of her plans. Additionally, the fact that the staff bot table in the post-it room almost certainly represents the Afton family, while having a bot that looks to be the mother at the head of the table of all places feels intentional, especially when you consider that this is a room with a lot of attention drawn to it. As much as people now often say that this room was actually somewhere the Mimic just drew scribbly pictures while in a William Afton persona, I don't think that's what's going on in the post-it room for a couple reasons. For one thing, there isn't actually much evidence that the Mimic had any desire to pretend to be William Afton. That's not to say that the Mimic isn't involved with Glitchtrap, of course, since there is decent evidence that it is involved considering how in the books the Mimic 1 program was used to create games, presumably like Help Wanted. However, based on what we know about how the Mimic actually works, I don't think that the theory that Glitchtrap and Burntrap are the Mimic trying to be William really holds up. I could understand it somewhat before the Mimic's appearance in Ruin, but considering the fact that the Mimic and Burntrap look absolutely nothing alike except for a single hand that only looks similar rather than the same, and despite claims to the contrary, does not have markings that line up with Burntrap's flesh bits, I don't see how Burntrap could be the Mimic pretending to be William. Plus, we actually get the Mimic's point of view during one of the epilogues and Tales from the Pizzaplex that takes place while the Pizzaplex is being built and therefore after Glitchtrap already existed, and nothing about it indicates that the Mimic was trying to be William. Rather, it was running a rather basic thought process about navigating the circumstances it was in to complete its goal of, delimbing and decapitating a group of teenagers because it was programmed to do that to endoskeletons. While some have suggested that different strains of the Mimic program had different goals, that still wouldn't explain Glitchtrap since Glitchtrap was active at the Pizzaplex, but the standard Mimic program at the Pizzaplex and Tales always chose to represent itself as a white tiger with green and blue eyes, not as anything related to William like Glitchtrap is. Once again, not to say the Mimic isn't involved with Glitchtrap, but like I mentioned in some of my previous videos, I think the reason Glitchtrap is a rabbit is most likely due to foreign code that's mentioned in cut dialogue from Help Wanted 2 and is implied to originate from William, and his memories of his victims, including Charlie Emily, who the Mimic wouldn't have witnessed the death of. I'm not gonna go go into a full explanation in this video for the sake of time, but even if Glitchtrap was the Mimic going out of character and pulling a William Afton impersonation with no outside influence, someone or something had to be physically present to do the writing in the post-it room to make the notes and set up the table. And I don't think it's very likely the Mimic was ever physically in the main pizzaplex. I think a lot more people would have died if the murder-happy endoskeleton was ever let out of the basement and into a place where it could access hundreds of people, and considering it's trapped in the Pizzeria Simulator location where the pizzaplex is being built in the books, and it's back behind a wall of concrete by the time Ruin comes around in the games, I don't see why or how it would have gotten out of that location only to go back before security breach. That being said, even if it was the Mimic who set up the table, it doesn't change the fact that it stands out that the bot representing Mrs. Afton is at the head of the table instead of William, who was the big bad throughout the first arc of the franchise. I can entirely understand why it led MatPat to suggest that Mrs. Afton played a bigger role in the current arc. That being said, while the theories about the other Aftons returning in one way or another are things I intend to circle back to in future videos, I do think the fact that Scott mentioned that Ruin was course correcting the direction of the story means that whatever may or may not have been going on with the Aftons in the background, there would need to be more evidence as to how Mrs. Afton would be around and what she would be doing, rather than just the hints we maybe get in Security Breach. Fortunately, there are other FNAF projects Scott has worked on that I think could provide just that. One thing that caught my attention with the Tales from the Pizzaplex series was how the very first story, Frailty, connected back to the Fazbear Fright series. For those who aren't familiar, in Frailty, the main character Jessica has a pendant made of remnant that she uses to heal people by shaving off pieces of it. As she does, we find out that Jessica is a spirit functionally haunting a pile of metal garbage that's slowly falling apart as she uses up the remnant, and is only kept functional and human-looking by her pendant. And when she shaves off too much of it, she collapses into a pile of scrap metal. The reason this story stood out to me is because this isn't the first time we've had a girl made of trash with a remnant pendant in the series. In the Fazbear Frights books, there's a story about a girl named Sarah who finds and activates an animatronic named Eleanor that says it'll grant her a wish. Sarah wishes to be beautiful, Eleanor gives her a pendant, and while Sarah thinks Eleanor is making her prettier, it's actually an illusion from the necklace that hides the fact that bit by bit, Eleanor replaced Sarah's body with scraps. When the necklace fell off, Sarah fell apart, and Eleanor was able to use an illusion to pretend to be Sarah instead. Jessica in Tales seems to be in an eerily similar situation to Sarah, except she realized her condition and the power of the necklace, and used it to help others before completely falling apart. While Eleanor herself doesn't make an appearance, someone had to put Jessica in that condition and give her the necklace, and there isn't really anyone else it would logically be. Now, I don't necessarily think the Fazbear Frights books are in the same timeline as Tales, and the game's even less so considering how certain events like FNAF 3 aren't compatible and play out differently. I also think there are some things from Tales that don't line up with the games perfectly, like Edwin selling his failed vacuum company to Fazbear Entertainment in the books and having a seemingly successful costume manner in the games. However, Tales is still very relevant to the story of the games and has given us a lot of answers, like the identity of Patient 46 being GGY. So the fact that this first story in Tales connects to Eleanor implies she could be more important to the latest story arc than we may have guessed. But how does this relate to Mrs. Afton? Well, when Fazbear Frights came out, a lot of people assumed that Eleanor was the Fazbear Frights version of Circus Baby, since she's a female animatronic with green eyes and red pigtails that's described as looking clown-like. Not to mention, her name does share a first syllable with Elizabeth, the spirit in Circus Baby. There's also a scene in the epilogues where Eleanor temporarily merges with the amalgamation of animatronics William Afton took control over, and when she left the amalgamation, it's pointed out that William, as the amalgamation, watches her go with a pleading expression that turns into human-like despair. While it's possible that he was just missing the power she contributed to the amalgamation, since it is mentioned in a later epilogue that she was the source of its power, I feel like such an emotional response could easily imply that he had some sort of emotional attachment to her. Of course, I don't think she's actually Circus Baby, considering the differences in her name, other aspects of her appearance, and her plot purpose, but I don't think that means the similarities should be discounted. After all, why have an entirely separate clown-like animatronic character with green eyes and red pigtails if the readers aren't meant to draw connections between the two? To me, it feels like Eleanor could be meant to be a character related to Circus Baby, but not Circus Baby herself. So considering how her name is connected to, yet different from Elizabeth, why not a different female character who would naturally look similar to, yet different from her? One who William Afton may have had enough attachment to that he wouldn't want her to leave. Why not Mrs. Afton? Well, she would have to somehow become Eleanor for the theory to work, and we don't really have much information about either of them, especially Mrs. Afton. However, what we do know gives us some very interesting information to work with. From Fazbear Frights, we know that Eleanor is some sort of creature made of agony. Beneath the facade of her external appearance, she's described as a black, chaotic force that fed on human suffering. We also know she's got a remnant pendant that's implied to come from a guy who made it to protect himself from losing his daughter, but I don't think that's particularly associated associated with where Eleanor came from. After all, said daughter seems to be a minor. Meanwhile, it's indicated that Eleanor has been active for decades thanks to Into the Pit's infamous ball pit. Not because of the events of Into the Pit, though. Rather, in the Frights epilogues, there's this guy, Detective Larson, who got a whole bunch of blood samples from the ball pit, and found out they were all from the same person at different points of time spanning decades. A bunch of these dates lined up with the disappearances of Eleanor's victims, and in the final Frights epilogue, these black blood tentacles come out of her, so the blood is probably hers, which would mean that she most likely predates the necklace since it was made for someone who hasn't been around for decades like the blood samples. Not to mention, the fact that she has blood is quite interesting. It wouldn't make sense to be just from her victims since the books make it very clear that all of the blood comes from the same person. However, if she used to be human and was turned into this agony animatronic, especially if it was in a similar manner to her tendency to replace body parts with metal bits, leading to an intermingling of the parts and blood, that would explain both why she'd have blood and why it would be unique to her, no matter who her victim was. As for how she would go from human to power-hungry agony abomination, that's where I think the potential connections to Mrs. Afton would be relevant. Mrs. Afton is strangely absent throughout all of the FNAF games. We see William, Michael, Elizabeth, and the crying child, but you would think that their mother would have something to say about, you know, all her kids dying and or disappearing. The thing is, I think we actually do know at least part of what happened to her thanks to Vanessa. Now, before anyone leaves an angry comment about how Vanessa isn't Elizabeth Afton and we can't use Vanessa as evidence for Elizabeth, that's not the point I'm trying to make here. Whether or not Vanessa is literally or a parallel to Elizabeth in Security Breach, I'd be surprised if she wasn't at least meant to represent Elizabeth in the games, considering Scott decided to make Vanessa literally William Afton's daughter in the FNAF movie, especially since the movie script was finished and filmed well after Security Breach and the theories connecting Vanessa to the role of William's daughter became well known. And the connections aren't particularly subtle. She's got green eyes like Elizabeth, her last initial is an A like in Afton, she doesn't like being in dark basements like Elizabeth as Circus Baby, her dad's name is Bill according to her therapy files, which is a nickname for William, and she basically says that Glitchtrap is literally her father when she tells her therapist she can't talk about the Vanny costume because a certain he told her he would always be watching, only for her therapist to respond that she needed to resolve her daddy issues and Vanessa to say that she had because she had compartmentalized him and locked him away. Therefore, Glitchtrap. But regardless of whether Glitchtrap is actually William or not, that's at least the persona of Bill Afton, who is considered by Vanessa and her therapist and her files to be her father. This could potentially be due to the canonical tampering that happened to Vanessa's files where the therapist got the information from in the first place. Even if her actual father isn't William Afton and she's just being brainwashed into taking on the role of his daughter, the information the therapists have for her seems to indicate that he actually is. I emphasize this point because I find it very interesting that in one of the therapy sessions, the same one where the therapist mentions having gotten to know Vanessa from the files where her dad is named Bill, there's a startling amount of focus on Vanessa's mom and dad getting a divorce. Most of the conversation focuses on how Vanessa follows instructions, particularly those from her father, like when he manipulated her into giving false testimony in court against her mother during the divorce, and the therapist assures her that what happened wasn't her fault. However, one interesting detail is that the therapist says,
"I know your mum after she lost the custody case."
The fact that the creators of the game bothered to include the details of something happening to Vanessa's mother, only to hide what exactly that something was with Static, not only draws attention to that detail, but makes it seem like whatever happened to her is something important enough to hide. And if her dad in the therapy sessions is meant to be or represent William Afton, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Mrs. Afton is meant to be represented by Vanessa's mother. And if that's the case, I think it's pretty likely that this therapy recording is meant to inform us that the reason Mrs. Afton doesn't seem to be around in the games is partially because she divorced William only to not end up with custody of the kids because William manipulated them, and partly because something happened to her afterwards that kept her out of the picture. Now, we don't really have any information about what specifically could have happened to her, but considering the potential connections between her and Eleanor, I think it's possible that whatever it was, whether it be her death, an injury, or going missing, made her vulnerable to William finding a way to use her for his experiments to figure out Remnant. Considering William married her in the first place and in Fazbear Frights was upset when Eleanor left, I could see it being the case where, while his feelings toward her may have been more possessiveness than actual love, he wasn't happy she left him and wanted to make sure she couldn't leave him again. Maybe after Eleanor stopped being useful to him as his wife, he was able to stage some sort of accident to use her for his experiments. Maybe he found a way to merge her with the animatronic we know as Eleanor through agony, but the agony twisted what was left of her into the monstrosity we see in the Fazbear Frights books. And maybe she'll end up taking after her husband in terms of always coming back. And hey, if she is around as of Security Breach, her ability to make herself look like other people could mean she's the person pulling the strings at Fazbear, getting handing Vanessa the security position and choosing the build site to be directly over the location of her ex-husband's body. Remnant certainly has a tendency to pop up at locations like that, so orchestrating everything could be her way of getting a hold of it. So does MatPat's theory about Mrs. Afton being the CEO and current mastermind of Fazbear Entertainment technically hold up, at least in one form or another? Kinda. Do I believe that's what's going on? Not really, no. I do currently believe that Eleanor is potentially Mrs. Afton and that she may end up making a game appearance in the future, but if Mrs. Afton died and became Eleanor, she probably wouldn't be inheriting the company. Not to mention, Matt did say after talking to Scott Cawthon that he got the story of security breach wrong, and my guess is that was most likely the stuff about Mrs. Afton being the mastermind trying to bring her family back, which is why this was originally going to be an April Fool's Day video up until I realized I was talking too much about stuff I actually thought was plausible and had been sitting on for years, and then turned this into an actual theory video. That being said, it was a really interesting idea, and I feel like there's a lot more evidence for it than people gave it credit for. That being said, just because there's evidence for something, that doesn't mean it's accurate. It's all just theories at the end of the day. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe or become a channel member. I've missed talking about security breach stuff that isn't just the Mimic, so I'm probably going to make more videos going over old theories like this, or just talking about stuff I think is neat. Thanks for watching, don't get stabbed, and have a nice day.